I want to introduce you to one of the most well-known and highly respected New Testament scholars. This gentleman has written over 30 books about the Bible and is currently a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so his name is Dr. Bart Ehrman, and we're going to be hearing from him a lot on this channel because he has a lot to say. And so I want you to hear his story about what he eventually learned about the Bible through his questioning, studying, and thinking that moved him away from being someone who was just a Bible believer. Here we go.
So I'm a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've taught here since 1988, which makes me the old geezer on the faculty. And I've long been interested in a large range of issues, just about every issue connected with what happens in the New Testament and Christianity for the first 400 years. I write books for scholars in those areas, and I try to communicate with broader audiences. And so this podcast will be part of that, trying to communicate the kinds of things scholars talk about and know about to lay people who would be interested if they just knew about it. And so that's the point.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think it's very important to be able to talk to lay people. And I think it's something that a lot of academics really struggle with. So I'm glad that there are people like you out here doing that important work. So moving to the episode's topic, could you maybe take a minute and explain what impact learning about the textual history of the New Testament had on you as a young man?
Yeah, right. So I started out as I was raised in a Christian household, but we weren't particularly religious. But when I was in high school, I had a born again experience, and I became a conservative evangelical Christian. I was completely committed to the faith, to a relationship with Christ, and I believed that the Bible was the inerrant Word of God. That's what I had been taught in those circles. And so I went off to a fundamentalist Bible college, went to Moody Bible Institute, and I started studying the Bible. But one of the things I learned early on was that with the New Testament, it's true with the Old Testament too, but with the New Testament, we don't have the original manuscripts. We don't have the documents that the authors actually wrote. So when Mark wrote a gospel, he wrote something, and we don't have that thing he wrote. We have copies of it that were made later. And we actually don't have copies. We've got copies of copies of copies that are many centuries later most of the time. And so I realized that as an evangelical. But the more I studied it, I did a degree at Wheaton College, an English degree. Then I went to Princeton Theological Seminary to do a master's degree studying the New Testament rigorously. And by this time I had Greek. And I started studying the New Testament rigorously in Greek. And these manuscripts started bothering me a little bit because I had believed that the Bible was God's words. It's not just that it was like his communication broadly. It was his very words. But then as more I thought about it, I realized, there are places where we don't know what the words are. There are entire passages in the Bible that I was familiar with that probably weren't originally there. They're in some manuscripts, but not in other manuscripts. And so somebody's either added them or somebody's taken them away. And how do we know? And so it started that for me. That started kind of an avalanche of doubt. Like I didn't make me become a non-Christian or anything. It's just like, wow, why is that? If God gave us His words, why don't we have them? And so this study, this kind of thing that I talk about in some of my books is related to that and my faith journey. Then
I think your story is probably very familiar to a lot of agnostic and atheist people. I know personally a lot of my friends have had very similar experiences. For you, what did learning Greek specifically, what impact did that have on your kind of personal faith journey?
Yeah, no, Greek was the thing, because I had gone through Moody Bible Institute for 3 years and didn't know Greek, but I was really rigorously studying the text in English. I realized, look, if you really want to understand the nuance of what an author's saying, you've got to read it in the original language. I mean, it's just it seems like common sense, but once you start learning these languages and start reading texts in them, you realize, wow, there is just no way to put that sentence into English and capture all the nuance. You just can't, because the words aren't exactly the same. And so I wanted to study Greek, and so I studied Greek in college when I went to Wheaton College and did Greek there, and And that's when I realized I wanted to do a PhD in New Testament, because I was good at Greek, pretty good enough, and I liked it. And so studying Greek made me start digging deeper and deeper into the text. And you start realizing that you see things that you can't see in English. And some of the things I started seeing started bothering me because I started realizing, that doesn't say what I thought it said. And in fact, what Mark says here in this verse in Greek doesn't line up very well with what Matthew says about the same thing. I said, oh boy, here we go. And so it started me, again, it didn't start me to be a non-Christian or anything. It just started me realizing how deep these kinds of questions are when you think they're pretty simple, right? Reading the Bible, how hard can it be? Just read the Bible. Turns out it's hard.
Thank you. So as an Assyriologist, one of the advantages I have, I think, over biblical studies is that my field actually has the original copies of the texts we study, because they're written on clay, which lasts an awful lot longer than papyrus does. And you mentioned already that what you have when you're working with the New Testament are copies of copies of copies. When in your academic career do you think you first truly understood how removed our Bible, our New Testament, is from the original manuscripts of the New Testament texts? And what kind of impact did that have?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question and an important one. And you're right. I mean, for a lot of the culture of the ancient Near East, which you know better than any of us, if somebody writes something on a clay tablet, they stick it in a storage room someplace and it stays there for 2,000 years or whatever. And for the New Testament, we're dealing with these. It's written on papyrus, which are it's sort of the ancient equivalent of paper. And papyrus actually lasts pretty long, but part of the problem is these papyrus, say the copy of Paul's letter to the Galatians. He writes this, probably had it written on papyrus, and he sent it off to some churches to read, and they read it, and then they kept reading it and reading it and reading. As pages wear out, you get one of these paperback books. After a while, you start losing pages, and that's just like, this was a book made 10 years ago. What if the manuscript's 100 years old or 200 years old? You start losing things, and then and the thing is that you're not only losing things, but because they're wearing out, you've got to copy them. And the big problem is that when anybody copies a long text, they're going to make mistakes. My students don't believe me sometimes when I say that. So I tell them, okay, go home tonight and copy the Gospel of Matthew and see how well you do. Because I'm just telling you, you're going to get sleepy, or your roommates are going to start making noise, or you're going to get inattentive, your mind's going to wander, you're going to leave out a word, or you're going to miss. It's like, it just happens. It happens. But then somebody copies that copy that you've just made. You made this copy and you made mistakes, but the person who's copying it doesn't know those are mistakes necessarily. He might know, but then he just copies your mistakes, and then the next person copies both of your mistakes. It goes on like that for a long time. I don't think I really realized the gravity of the situation until I was in graduate school and started digging deeper into our manuscripts. I knew that there were some big changes, and I just thought, well, we know what they are, and we know what the solution is. But as you start studying them, you realize we're not talking about a couple dozen places that the scribes changed. We're talking about today's scholars think that there, among our many, many manuscripts of the New Testament, there are probably something like 500,000 differences among our manuscripts. And so, whoa!
That's not an insignificant number.
And so I didn't realize that when I was an evangelical, and for a lot of evangelicals that doesn't matter very much, but for me, it did start to matter.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that possibly might surprise people who are maybe Christians, maybe very familiar with the Bible, is that these variants, these changes haven't all been magically resolved in the English translations that we read today, right? We still have these problems in the Bible that is used in churches.
Well, that's right, and that's a long and complicated story that we'll probably get into some of the details later. But the reality of some of the favorite passages that we know in the Bible that are among my favorite passages are almost certainly not originally there. This isn't just kind of the crazy idea of of a liberal New Testament scholar teaches at Chapel Hill. This is, I knew this when I was at Moody Bible Institute. It just didn't bother me very much. But the famous story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, I think it's got to be the most famous story in the Gospels because it's in every Jesus movie ever made. So it's like this woman's been caught in adultery, and they drag her in front of Jesus. And they say she's been caught in the act of adultery. The Jewish leaders say she's been caught in the act of adultery. And according to the law of Moses, we're supposed to stone her to death. What do you say? And so this is setting up a trap because if he says, well, yeah, stone her to death, then he's violating his own teachings of love and forgiveness and mercy. But if he says, no, let her go, then he's breaking the law of Moses. And so what's he supposed to do? Well, he stoops down, he starts writing on the ground, and he looks up and he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. He stoops back down, starts writing on the ground again. They all start realizing they're sinful, and they walk away one by one until he's left alone with the woman. He stands up and he says, is there no one here left to condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, no one. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. This is a fantastic story. This is a wonderful story. It's a great story, but it's not in any of the old manuscripts of the Gospel of John. Church fathers who wrote commentaries on John don't know about it until the 12th century in Greek. And so this is not a debated thing among scholars that this passage doesn't belong in the Gospel of John, or it's nowhere else in the New Testament. But you're still going to find it in your Bibles. And so the question is, the thing is, the translators know it doesn't belong either, but they're not about to leave it out because you won't buy their Bible if you don't have that story in it.
And you know who else knows that it doesn't belong there? The pastors, preachers, and the ministers who have attended seminary schools. They learn a lot of these same things, and they come out teaching the gospel like nothing ever happened. And what will happen if someone calls them out on this part of the scripture not being originally there? Most of them, what they're going to do is they're going to make up some type of fancy runaround type of explanation, or they're going to tell you that it doesn't matter that much, right? But what matters is that you're covered by the blood of Jesus. And what will happen if many people, when they hear that, they're just going to fall right back to sleep. And if we were not in the information age today, where the common Western person could easily get access to this information from real professors and real scholars in the field, that many of the religious clergy or the religious leaders, they would have just held on to this information and kept it amongst themselves and fed the crumbs of believership to the rest of the people, like they've been doing for many centuries in the past.
You'll read this and be like, where is this? Everyone knows this is in the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are other passages that are not as well known where a similar thing happens, or where scholars just can't agree among them, like hundreds of places where scholars just can't agree. What was the original wording here? Scholars who are, committed evangelicals to scholars who are atheists to everything in between just study these things with the same tools, and the evidence isn't clear. Was the passage worded this way, or was it worded that way? And most of the time, look, I need to be emphatic on this point. Most of the time, these differences don't matter for anything. Most of the differences, I said there are 500,000 differences. That counts spelling changes. like how do you spell a word? And who cares? But so the vast majority of them are really picayune and little, and like you can't even translate the difference. But some of them really matter. Mm-hmm. And they affect what a passage means, or even the theology of an entire book, depend on which passage, and scholars can't agree which one it is, this or that.
Now think about what's implied if the scholars can't agree on certain passages and what they mean. These are the people who are translating the Bible, the same Bible that you have in your hand and have at your home, right? It's not like the Bible just dropped down from heaven and landed in your house. People are making real decisions on what words are to be used in these translations. And some of them are not agreed on, like Dr. Bart Ehrman is saying.
How does that kind of realization affect you or anyone viewing the Bible as inerrantly inspired?
Well, this was what got me starting to wonder whether my views about the Bible were correct, because I believed that God had given us the words. I wasn't quite sure how it happened. I wasn't sure, did he dictate the words to the authors, or did he just make sure they didn't write the wrong words, or, what did God do to do it? But he did it, and the words, there were no mistakes in the words. And so that was my belief. But the more I thought about this problem that we have these changes in all these manuscripts, it made me wonder, well, if God wanted us to have his words, that's why he would have inspired them in the first place. So God wanted us to have his words. If he wanted us to have his words and he inspired the words, why didn't he make sure that we still have his words?
Mm-hmm. Now, isn't that an obvious question? If the book were inspired by a creator of the universe, then surely it should be expected that the message at least be perfectly intact, right? What it wants to deliver to the people. That should be a light thing to do. But if you ask some of these bona fide believers why that's not the case, what they're going to do is start talking for God, telling you that he moves in mysterious ways or wants people's faith to be tested. All these type of off the wall explanations that people can come up with that make much less sense than simply recognizing the most obvious thing is that these books were written and inspired by humans, right? And that's why they're not perfectly intact. And that's why they have contradictions, right? That's what's expected of something that's produced by humans.
It wouldn't be any more difficult. It wouldn't be more of a miracle to make sure the scribes didn't change anything significant. But he obviously didn't do that, because we know he didn't do that, because we can't decide what the words are sometimes. And so I started thinking, well, if I don't think God preserved the words, then I don't probably have no reason to think he actually inspired the words. And if that's the case, I started realizing the Bible is a very human book. Mm-hmm. This book was handed on by scribes who changed things. And if the scribes could change things, why couldn't the authors change things? God didn't stop the scribes. Why would he? What makes me think he stopped the authors?
And that's kind of related to an anecdote you tell in Misquoting Jesus, where you're a graduate student at Princeton. You're writing a paper for Cullen's story on a passage in Mark that contains a slight contradiction, and you described how you wrote a really long and complex argument explaining it away, and you're convinced that your professor is going to be very impressed and absolutely understand where you're coming from, because he himself is also a Christian. But the only comment you received was maybe Mark just made a mistake. This was from how you write about it, it was clearly a pivotal moment for you, but why was it so profound?
Well, it was because, I'd started wondering, if God, maybe God didn't give us the words. And I, as an evangelical, I was convinced there could not be any contradictions in the Bible, because if there's a contradiction, if you got a flat, I'm not talking about a difference, like John says one thing about Jesus, Matthew says a different thing. Well, they both might be just like one saying part of it and the other saying the other part. It doesn't necessarily, but if there's a contradiction, where actually they both can't be right, then, well, that's, one of them's wrong. Yeah. And so that was my view. And I started wondering about that because of these manuscripts. And so that's right. So I took this class, and it was early in my master's degree. And I wrote this long paper. It had to do with this passage. It has to do with the passage in Mark chapter 2. And in this case, it wasn't a problem about a scribe changing the text. It's what apparently was the original text. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus' disciples are going through the grain fields. And they're plucking. It's a Sabbath, and they're hungry, so they're eating some grain off of the stalks. And Pharisees are standing around, and they see what they're doing. They get all upset, and they tell Jesus to tell disciples stop that. They're not
control your people.
Get them under control here. They're your followers. And Jesus says, "Come on, don't you remember what King David did when Abiathar was the high priest, how he and his people were hungry and they went into the temple and they ate the showbread that only the priests are supposed to eat. Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. And so in other words, it's okay to eat if you're hungry on the Sabbath, even if it means plucking some grain. So the thing about the passage, we had to do a term paper. And my term paper was trying to explain this one little detail in this passage. It's when Jesus says that Abiathar was the high priest. All of our manuscripts have that Abiathar. So it's something that really was in the Gospel of Mark. But the thing is, when you read the passage in 1 Samuel, Abiathar was not the high priest. His father Ahimelech was the high priest at the time. And so this is one of these things, these little picayune little contradictions. And I wrote this big, I don't know, it was 30 pages or something, arguing on the basis of this detailed explanation of the grammar that, in fact, it's not a contradiction. That when Mark says Abiathar was the high priest, he doesn't mean Abiathar was the high priest. He just kind of means, I came up with some explanation for it's not a contradiction. And yeah, my professor, Colin Story, he was a very, very committed Christian and pretty conservative theologically, but he just, what if Mark just made a mistake? I'm like, maybe Mark, that's an easier solution. And once I realized that, that started opening the floodgates for me. If you could have one little contradiction, then you need to see if there are other little contradictions. And if you got other little, maybe a big contradictions, and it started changing my view of Scripture.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I see quite a lot online with online apologetics is a lot of people doing what you did in that paper and coming up with complex arguments to say, isn't it possible that X, that it's not a contradiction, that this isn't incorrect somehow? And I think the thing that often trips people up is you can say, well, it is possible, but is it plausible? Is that the most likely response or the most likely reason given the evidence we have? And it feels like that's kind of what Dr. Story did for you.
Well, that's right. I mean, all of history is a matter of establishing what's most probable. You're never going to definitively prove history because, it's not like a chemistry experiment where you can do it 1,000 times and come up with the same results. If you don't change the variables, history can't be repeated. And so all we do with history of every kind is just trying to establish what probably happened. And so with the Bible, I had been firmly convinced there were no errors. And so I was one of these guys who would, like these apologists, who would just, reconcile everything. Well, it could be this, it could be that. And after a while, you start looking at it and say, is that really likely? And the thing is, if you start getting if you just have one or two of these problems in the Bible, you could probably do that. But when you've got dozens and hundreds of them just in the New Testament, you get to a point you're saying, every one of these, I've got to say the unlikely thing is the right one, every time.
And that's what happens when they try to use the tool of belief in the place where the tool of reason is supposed to be used. And what happens is they end up falling in the pit of believing something that is not the most likely explanation. And most of the time, this is something that they have been taught since a child, right? So it's not their fault. But what they do is they end up trying to preserve this belief because this is something that they have grown emotionally attached to or something that they have found comfort in, right? And so we're talking about human nature here and a human response.
Yeah.
So at a point, I got to a point where I just said, look, it is humanly possible to write an inerrant book. I mean, I can write an email that lists all the addresses of everybody in my neighborhood and not make a single mistake. It could be inerrant. But how do we decide if something is inerrant? Well, one way is to go in ahead of time and say, look, whatever else somebody tells me, I know this is inerrant. And so if you see something that looks like an error, well, it can't be an error because it's inerrant. And so you reconcile. The other way to do it is just to look at it and see, is it inerrant? And then decide. And so if you're doing this list of addresses, just look, do they have the wrong address there? And if you find errors, so it's a different way of doing it. And it's a different way of doing it theologically. So instead of starting out by saying the Bible has to be inerrant because God says it's inerrant and I believe, and so therefore it is inerrant. Instead of that, why don't you just look to see if it's inerrant? Because if it's not, then the truth is that it's not. That's the truth. And the truth should matter to Christians.
It should. And people often say it does, but I suspect, as you well know, when the truth means a drastic shift in your own personal faith, that is a little more challenging.
Well, and the thing is, it's not like correcting a mathematical problem. It's like you wrong on your math test and you realize, oh yeah, I messed that one up. I divided by 0. You can't do that. It's not like that kind of thing. It's more like something that's the very core of your existence. Your faith. I mean, it's what you believe reality to be about, and truth and meaning and the world and your human. And so these kinds of faith issues end up being far more deeply disturbing than just matters of, regular matters of fact.
Mm-hmm. No, I would definitely agree with you. So changing tact slightly, and you mentioned this earlier. One of the things that struck me personally when I started learning ancient languages and doing my own translation work is exactly how nuanced a job it is. Sitting down and working out which translation this particular word needs to have in this context is difficult, really. And when you have things like errors in spelling, it can throw off an entire passage. Did you have any similar translation difficulties that you found troubling when you were looking at the New Testament as an evangelical scholar?
Well, I certainly realized that just changing a single letter sometimes can change what an entire passage means. And a lot of times this gets down into kind of subtleties. And so I'll be the first to admit that sometimes they end up being important things, but sometimes they're pretty big things. I'll give you one example. There's this passage in 1 Timothy 3, 1 Timothy 3:16, which says, which is sometimes used to argue that Jesus is called God. Because it says, if you look at 1 Timothy 3:16, it says Jesus Christ, who, and it goes on to say so-and-so, go on to say such and such, Jesus Christ, who, or in some manuscripts, instead of saying Jesus Christ, who, it says Jesus Christ, God, who, okay? Yeah. So in that case, it's calling Jesus Christ God. And the thing is, this is one of those things you just wouldn't know. You look at this translation and you think, well, this translation says Jesus, it's called Jesus God. This one just says who, it's a relative pronoun. And so what's that all about? Well, I'll tell you what it's about. There are two letters in Greek. There's a theta, which looks like a zero with a line through it. And there's an omicron, which is an O. So you got an O, or you have an O going with a line through the middle. Okay. If the original text had the theta, the O with a line through it, it calls Jesus God. If it's just the O without the line through it, it's who.
Oh dear.
And so, which is it? It's just what, it's not even just, it's one letter. It's also like, it's just a line. And that affects whether the New Testament ever directly calls Jesus, whether the Apostle Paul ever calls Jesus directly God or not. So yeah, it's,
wow.
important.
That is a huge theological thing.
Big, based on like a line going through a letter.
Wow. So how do you try and work out which is the original then?
Well, the funny thing is there's actually a long discussion about this among scholarship. There was this 17th century scholar named Wettstein, 18th century scholar named Wettstein, who was looking at the oldest manuscript available for 1 Timothy that others had looked at and had said that it had the theta, that it said God. And so he was examining this manuscript and he's looking at it very closely, and he realizes that on the page where it looks like you've got that zero with the line through the theta, that the line that's going through that zero actually isn't on that side of the page. On the other side of the page, there's writing on the other side, and there's a line on the other side exactly across from the omicron, from the O, and that line is bled through the page. The ink is bled through the page to make it look like that omicron is a theta.
Wow.
And he sees this and says, oh my God, that's an omicron. That is not a theta. And this is our oldest manuscript. And in his case, in Wettstein's case, it started making him think that Jesus really wasn't God. It was like a big turn in his life. And, oh my God. So yeah. So sometimes, the smallest little details can make a big difference. And, and most Bible readers, of course, aren't, they don't go into the details, but the details end up mattering sometimes.
Significantly so. Wow. That's a lot. That changes like the entire theology behind Christianity as a modern religion.
Yep. Yeah,
Gracious.
of course, evangelicals will say, "Yeah, well, that's that passage, but you can use this passage and that passage, that passage,
Mm-hmm.
and that's absolutely right." When I wrote this book, Misquoting Jesus, which is what we're calling the podcast, as people will have noticed, because it's we're using it in kind of the broad sense of like issues with the Bible, but when I wrote this book, Misquoting Jesus, I pointed out lots and lots of changes like this in our manuscripts that had a big effect. And my evangelical opponents, who are almost always friends of mine, I mean, they're academic friends of mine, some are personal friends of mine. A lot of them have pointed out, yeah, look, these are picky and little things. They don't really matter for very much, and they have that kind of view, and they say things like, none of these changes affects any of the major doctrines of Christianity. And so they're not that important. And the thing is, I agree with them that none of these single changes, this change in 1 Timothy 3:16 is not going to change the Nicene Creed. It's not going to change everything because it's not that kind of thing. I mean, you'd have to change everything. So that doesn't mean it's not important. It's important whether the Apostle Paul, thought Jesus was God or not. And if it's not in that passage, which passage is it? And you have to look at all of them. But the way I explain it to people is that these textual changes among the manuscripts, maybe they won't affect your doctrine of the Trinity, or maybe they won't affect your view about the Holy Spirit, or maybe they won't affect some major doctrine you've got. I said, but if tomorrow morning we all woke up and it turned out that the New Testaments around the world, suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, we no longer had the Gospel of Mark, the book of Hebrews, or the book of James. Suppose like those three books just disappeared. Would that matter?
Yeah.
Yes, that would matter. Would it change any essential doctrine of Christianity? No. So the essential doctrines of Christianity are not the only things that matter.
Thank you. Somewhat related to that, actually, you've mentioned that a lot of people who study the Bible, New Testament scholars, are evangelicals and remain so, despite knowing the same things about the text that and being familiar with the variants and the problems with all the manuscripts that we have. Do you have any thoughts on why some people retain their faith through this process and some people don't?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, obviously, because I myself have left that camp, and I know others also who have left the camp. Some have left it because of these problems, the manuscripts. But I'd say most people, that isn't what does it. And for me, that isn't what did it either. I've been kind of upset over the years because some evangelical scholars, including friends of mine, have written books in which they said that I, Bart Ehrman, left the faith because I found out there were so many mistakes in the manuscripts. And they're kind of doing that in a mocking way, like, that's why you left the faith? That's kind of crazy. And when I first read this, I guess I won't name names here, but I certainly can. When I first did this, I read it, I said, what in the world? I called him up and said, what are you talking about? That's not why I left the faith. It had nothing to do with it. I knew all that when I was an evangelical. So what ends up happening is people start studying and they realize something like this thing about the scribes changing the text. And they realize, well, it's a very human process copying books. And then isn't it a very human process writing books? Like the authors were human. And then they start seeing the humanness of the Bible. And that's when they start seeing things like contradictions. And for me, it was the contradictions that led me away from being an evangelical. Mm-hmm. And so evangelicals have no trouble recognizing there are manuscripts, there are differences in the manuscripts. You need to figure out the original text. Most evangelicals, that's not very problematic, but it's the contradictions and the mistakes in the Bible, the errors, just flat out errors, geographical errors, historical errors, scientific errors. That tends to lead people away from an evangelical point of view once they realize these really are errors. But I do want to be clear that none of that led me away from being a Christian. I mean, I realized once I realized the Bible had contradictions and mistakes and other things, I continued to be a Christian for probably 15 years. I continued to be a church-going, Sunday school teaching Christian. And so that this kind of biblical scholarship, I don't think is the sort of thing that should lead somebody away from their faith, unless their faith is just that the Bible has to be inerrant or I won't be a Christian. And if that's your view, you got a very strange view of Christianity. I gotta tell you, I know a lot of people have that view, but that is not what historical Christianity ever was. And so for me, it didn't make me be a non-Christian. It just made me not believe in the inerrancy of the Bible anymore.
Thank you. So looking then at textual variants and the maybe historical understanding of them, in Misquoting Jesus, you go into some detail of how the New Testament has been studied academically and how that study started. And it looks like the first real examination of textual variants was published in 1707 by John Mill, who was from the University of Oxford. At the time, how did people react to this knowledge?
Yeah, well, I was saying I got upset about people reacted to misquoting Jesus. It was nothing like what John Mill got. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he died 2 weeks after he published his book, and so he didn't know about it. But he published. So in 1707, John Mill published an edition of the Greek New Testament, where he had studied about 100 manuscripts of the New Testament, and he'd studied various, and he realized that this verse is worded differently in this manuscript or this manuscript, and he at the bottom. So what he did is he print a few lines of the text, and at the bottom of the page he would print where manuscripts had different readings. When one manuscript said this word or that word or whatever, and so, but he. In the entire edition of the New Testament, he found 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed, and people went ballistic because they saw this and they thought he's attacking the Bible. You can't do that. And so there was this big controversy about it. And his defenders said, "Look, he's not attacking the Bible. He didn't invent these places. He's just telling you they exist. They exist whether he said it or not. And, you can either ignore it or you can deal with it." And so it led to a huge furor. And it's in some ways what started the entire discipline of New Testament textual criticism, which is the field that we'll be talking about in the next podcast. But the field, it's a technical term, textual criticism. It doesn't mean studying text or learning the literary meaning of text. It means knowing what an author wrote. And when people were in such shock by these numbers, and of course, I'll point out that Mill had 100 manuscripts. Today we have something like 5,700 manuscripts. Yeah, we have so many and so many differences that, So it was a shocker when he published that.
So you said that there were people who essentially supported Mill and saying, look, they exist anyway. It's not his fault. One of the responses you go over in the book was by Richard Bentley, who was a professor at Cambridge. And he argued that, you should expect this large number of variants given the size of the corpus you're working with. And as you've said, people make mistakes when they're copying. If you have that many manuscripts, even if they have just one spelling error in each, that's going to be a lot of variation. But he also argued that because the variants existed before people knew about them, they shouldn't really shake your faith. It shouldn't really have much of an impact on Christianity as a whole. Was this a convincing argument for people at the time? And do people still find it convincing or not?
Well, so when John Mill published this in 1707, scholarship was starting to really expand in the classics and in history and the subjects in the classical liberal arts. And Bentley was a brilliant Greek scholar who published editions of a number of Greek authors. He was a classical scholar, but he had a good point. If you've got two manuscripts of say, Matthew, suppose you got two manuscripts and you compare them, you might find 100 differences between them, say, and most of them minor. But if you got three manuscripts, well, you might have like 150 differences. And then if you got five manuscripts and got 10, if you got 800 manuscripts of Matthew, you're going to have a lot of differences. And so Bentley's point was that, of course, the more manuscripts you get, the more differences you would expect that. And I think that's absolutely right. It did, though. People did have different views of it at the time. This was right around when the English deists were starting out. English deists were these people who were maintaining that reason is more important than revelation, and they were trying to have a reasonable way of looking at the world rather than simply accepting, an authority like the Bible or an authority like the Pope. And so they started arguing, look, these differences really matter. because Christianity isn't the same thing if your Bible's not reliable. And so it ended up leading to controversies. And it's one of these controversies where both sides got better at their arguments, which made the other side get better in their counter arguments, which made the other side get better in their argument. And it kind of went like that. So it really helped scholarship in an ironic way, scholarship about the Bible, as critics and supporters started developing deeper arguments.
Thank you. And we are going to have one last question before we move on to our next section. And this is a very personal one. So early scholars tried to uncover the original text for theological reasons. A lot of people are still on that same journey. Why does finding the original matter to you? Or indeed, does it matter?
So when scholars started exploring these variant readings, as they're called, when John Mill finds 30,000 of them, scholars mainly wanted to know, look, what did the authors write? Because those are the inspired words. And so there was a big push to find the original texts of the New Testament. And that push continues today. It is the reason probably most experts are interested in studying our surviving manuscripts so that we can know what the authors wrote. Because they're the inspired words, and you want to know what the words are, and so that absolutely makes sense. About maybe 30 or 40 years ago, a lot of scholars started getting interested in a related but different question, which was, why did scribes change these things? Like if you've got a scribe suppose a scribe intentionally changes it from saying Christ who so and so to saying Christ God. Why would somebody want to change that from who to God? And people start saying, this would really help us understand what early Christians were saying about Jesus and about God, and help understand how their theology is affecting how they're copying. And so there started this new movement that's also very big now of trying to understand why changes were made. It may not be as important to most people as what did the authors write, but so getting to the original. For many scholars continues to be, we want to know what God's word is. And so, but even for people like me, I am no longer a believing Christian, but I'm still fascinated with the Bible, and I'm fascinated by a lot of literature. And when I read Plato, I want to know what Plato wrote. I don't want to know what some scribe wanted him to write. I mean, I might be interested in that for other historical reasons or philosophical reasons. Or, when I read Shakespeare, there are different forms of Hamlet, and they are very different. And I'd like to know, which one did he come up with? Or is it even possible to know? It turns out in Shakespeare's case, there's no way to know. We can't know. And and Shakespeare scholars just admit that, most Shakespeare, we just can't know. And it's actually true with the New Testament too. There are many places where we can't know. Evangelical scholars will often say, well, that's not true. We really do know. But then you ask them, well, okay, why do you and this scholar disagree about these wording then? If we know, why doesn't everybody agree? Yeah. And so we don't know.
Think about that. The New Testament scholar, Dr. Bart Ehrman, is letting you know that there are places in the Bible where the real words can never be known, right? And this is why it's a mistake for people out there to make the statement and claim that the Bible is perfect and without error, because that's simply not true. But the Bible believers, what they've done is they've boxed themselves in with this belief, and it's to the point where they have to remain willfully ignorant if they want to keep this belief alive, right? And they get mad at people for pointing this out instead of getting mad at themselves for believing it, or getting mad at the religious institutions for indoctrinating them with this belief.
And so it's important for me because, when I read the Gospel of John, I'd like to know what the author said. For other people, it's important because for them, it matters because it's the Word of God.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing your experiences with me and with everyone listening.
And there you have it. Hopefully this has given you something to think about. Hopefully this has presented you with some information that you are maybe unaware of, and has given you some insight into other conversations that are taking place within other circles, right? That you may be cut off from, right? Cut off because the people that you are in the circle that you're in, maybe they don't know about this information, or if they do know about it, maybe they keep it amongst themselves, right? Who knows? But I'm bringing it out so people can see it and have access to it, because there's plenty of information out there that you may be unaware of, right? And a lot of this information could give you a different perspective that'll allow you to help climb yourself out of the pit and get into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.